We're going to talk a little bit about Teddy Roosevelt and the Roosevelt Library. I got to be honest, though, I'm going to start this with honesty and transparency. When they asked me to do this, I said, Teddy Roosevelt, I know more about Van Halen than I do Roosevelt. So, in the spirit of that,
Wow.
I thought this might help.
That's great.
Thank you.
Now we know why the sound engineer was scared.
Does it fit? I'm not sure. I don't even know how it looks, but
Are we talking about Daniel Boone or TR?
see, now these guys are experts in Teddy Roosevelt, and I've gotten to know both of them here in the last day, and I'm in awe. So let's get right into it. You've got the introductions in the book, but Rolf, talk to me about Teddy Roosevelt. How did he end up in North Dakota?
Took the train.
Okay, Ed.
Well, if we could dial back to the spring of 1883 and look in on TR, we would find that he is a very successful, brilliant 24-year-old New Yorker from a privileged family, a family with high social standing and lots of influence in New York. His father had a glass importing business. It was a very successful business. They were wealthy people, not immensely wealthy, but certainly in the upper crust of New York society. And TR, by age 24, was already a very remarkably successful young man. He'd graduated from Harvard University with honors. He'd spent a year at the Columbia Law School. He decided he didn't like that, but he did well there. He was the author of a very critically acclaimed book on the Naval War of 1812, and he was married to the love of his life, Alice. On May the 28th of that year, he attended a meeting of the New York Free Trade Club, where he was one of the speakers. TR had already served 2 terms in the New York State Assembly. He was the youngest person in the State Assembly. He was invited to speak on the merits of free trade. And while he was at that meeting, he met a guy named Henry Goring, or Gorringe, it's sometimes pronounced, but I prefer Goring. And after the meeting was over, TR and Goring talked, and they found they had quite a lot in common. Goring had been a naval commander, and TR had written the book about the Naval War of 1812, so they had that in common. They also shared a great love of hunting. And Goring told TR that he and 2 other partners had just bought something called a military outpost called the Badlands Cantonment, which was located at the point where the Northern Pacific tracks crossed the Little Missouri River, the place that we all now know as Medora. But at that time, Medora didn't exist. A little tiny town called Little Missouri had sprung up there by...
So somewhat by luck that he ended up there.
They planned then to go hunting because Goring had bought this place intending to turn it into an outfitting camp for hunters and for tourists. And he talked about the big herds of buffalo and other wild game that were there. And of course, TR, very excited about all of that, wanted to get in on it. He said he wanted to kill a buffalo while there were still buffalo to be shot. And he and Goring planned to hunt for that fall.
Okay.
So in September, but about 4 days before the hunt was supposed to come off, or they were supposed to leave, Goring bailed out, and so TR was faced with the choice of either going it alone or abandoning the hunt altogether. Of course, he decided he would press on by himself, and so he arrived in the Badlands on September the 8th. And 2 o'clock in the morning. Now, this is a little bit of an aside, and I'll stop talking here, but
that's all right.
A remarkable thing happened
You're getting to
then.
the question. I was worried at first.
No, I'm done with the question.
All right.
I'm done with the question. Okay. This is an aside.
All right.
Because the week of September 2nd through the 8th was a most remarkable period in the history of Medora, in that 3 American presidents have visited Medora, and they all, by some coincidence, arrived there during that same calendar week. On Sunday, the 2nd, Chester A. Arthur came through on his way back to Washington after visiting Yellowstone National Park. And then on Thursday, Ulysses S. Grant came through because he was going to Montana to attend the last spike ceremony where they joined the 2 ends of the Northern Pacific Railroad. And on 2 o'clock in the morning on Saturday, TR arrived in the Badlands on the train.
Wow. Yeah, right, on the train. So the Badlands have been called the cradle of conservation. Tell me, where did that come about and why?
Well, I think the phrase was probably coined by Douglas Brinkley in his book Wilderness Warrior, if I have that right. But what he's talking about there is that North Dakota had huge impact on Theodore Roosevelt, on his ideas, and eventually on some of his politics and policies, most importantly in the area of conservation. Because even at the time when Henry Goring was telling Roosevelt about all the wild game that was in the Badlands, it was true. That was in the spring of 1883.
Okay.
But this was a pivotal time, of course, in the history of the West. The Indians had been driven onto the reservations. The buffalo were killed. By the time Roosevelt got there in September, the buffalo were essentially gone. He had to hunt very hard for 2 weeks to find one bull that he could kill. Okay? And so, in that very short time, the winter of 1886, 1887 essentially destroyed the open range cattle industry on the northern plains, not just in the Badlands, but across the northern plains. There had been a drought and huge overgrazing. Huge herds had been pushed up from Texas. Big cattle drives that we hear about, and others had been hauled in on the railroads. And there was a tremendous amount of overgrazing. So it was a combination of drought, overgrazing, unrestricted hunting, and this horrible winter when about 2/3 of all of the cattle died across the northern plains.
Okay.
But the point is that Roosevelt witnessed all of this on his own ranches out here in the Dakota Badlands. Now, Roosevelt traveled extensively, and I'm sure every muddy stream he ever crossed made some impression on his soul. But here he saw firsthand on his own ranches the devastation that was caused by unrestricted hunting and by overgrazing. And the range was destroyed. It happened in about 5 years. It was just unbelievable. And so a lot of his policies or his ideas on conservation stem from the observations that he made here on his ranches. And so the ranches, and particularly the Elkhorn Ranch, are called the cradle of conservation.
And did he talk about being in North Dakota and it made him what?
President?
You, yes.
He's queuing
Yeah,
up.
you tell me. Yeah. Yeah. I just Google searched a few things today. You're the expert.
Well,
I'd have never been president.
That's
if
where
not
I
for
got
my time in North Dakota.
Yeah, okay.
yes,
26.
that is the famous statement that he made that we North Dakotans are so fond of quoting. And I love that quote, so don't get this wrong. He made that statement here in Fargo. What we have to acknowledge is that he made it in the context of a political speech, and so has a little bit of a cloud on it. As a matter of fact, if you were to go to the Buffalo Bill Cody Museum in Wyoming, you'll find there the saddle that TR used while he was out here in North Dakota, in Dakota. But right next to it is a big placard with another one of his quotes on it, and this time, and it's true, he did say this, he made this speech in Billings. He says, if it hadn't been for my time living in Montana, it was almost like it was a fill-in-the-blank political, where are we today sort of speech.
But now, come on now. And he writes to Senator Fell of New Mexico that if you were to take away all the experiences in all of his life, if you were to wipe away his memory, what one would he keep? He would keep the memory of his time in Dakota.
That's
we can do this all
exactly
night.
right.
Yeah, right.
We could just,
right.
we could do this all night.
And I think, and I like that quote much better. He made that to Albert Fall, who was his friend. It was not in the context of a political speech, who eventually became Senator Albert Fall from New Mexico. But if we go back to the first sentence, the one that he made in Fargo, where he said he wouldn't have been president for his time here, the fact that it was made in a political speech doesn't mean that it wasn't true.
Yeah.
And in fact,
Right.
I think it was true. And we point to some very specific things to back that up. Now, some people say that all he meant by that was that this was an important period in his life and he profited from it, and without it he would have been a lesser man, and who knows what would have happened. But if we look at the specific chain of events that propelled Roosevelt into the White House, we really started with his involvement in the Spanish-American War. He was the hero of the war, Kettle Hill and San Juan Hill and all of that. When he came back from the war, he was a national hero, and it propelled him into the governorship of New York. And I think very few people would argue that he would have been governor of New York, at least at that point, but for his status as the hero of the Spanish-American War. And of course, then you can say if he hadn't been governor of New York, the politicians and the party bosses wouldn't have exiled him to the vice presidency. And if he hadn't been vice president, then he wouldn't have been president.
Sure.
Well, who knows?
Sometimes it's better to be lucky than good.
Well, that's a
That's
fact.
true. Well, so Ed, the reason we're talking about Roosevelt here so much in North Dakota is the Theodore Roosevelt Library. And Ed has just been named the CEO of that. So as we talk about the past and we transfer into the future, Ed is the future of Roosevelt in North Dakota. So Ed, when I look at your resume, I see kind of this fancy pants Eastern guy. He's worked for ABC and he's worked for CNN, and I think, what do you know about North Dakota?
I have spent 20 years explaining lefse and hot dish to my Eastern friends.
So you have North Dakota roots.
This is an odd question for me to get. No, I was born and raised in North Dakota. My parents, Bill and Heather O'Keefe, are sitting in the audience tonight. They have been owner-operators of the McDonald's restaurants here in North Dakota for 40 years. Recently retired. My grandfather started the first McDonald's with indoor seating in North Dakota. So if you have ever enjoyed a cheeseburger in February, you have my grandfather to thank. When the governor, who I believe snuck in the back, by the way, and is with us here tonight, first started talking with me about this incredible role, he asked the question, why North Dakota? And I said, at that time, if you think about it, Theodore Roosevelt was a New Yorker by chance, but he was a North Dakotan by choice. That, if you think about TR, and there's so many wonderful TR-isms in the world, right? Keep your eyes on the stars and your feet on the ground. Good to the last drop, that was one of his as well. And my favorite is, do what you can with what you have where you are. Right? And when I was growing up in Grand Forks, North Dakota, I was taught that, to whom much is given, much is required. And I think that if this is an opportunity to do what I can with what I have right here in North Dakota and give back in a way that I hope radically transforms this incredibly special place, that was a serendipitous and providential opportunity I just simply couldn't pass up.
Can you talk a little bit about what the special place is, this library/museum? We hired somebody, or they hired someone with this media experience and background. What are you going to bring to the library and museum that maybe is different?
Well, so it kind of builds off of your question to Rolf. I mean, in 20 years in media, I've learned one important lesson, and that is that the shortest distance between two people is a story. And I think that what Rolf was talking about, if you fast forward one more year, Theodore Roosevelt returns to the Badlands of North Dakota because on the same day, in the same house, his wife and mother died on February 14th, 1884. He was devastated. You heard all the accomplishments, right? The best-selling book, the youngest person in the assembly, the law possibility, the Harvard honors. He quits. He leaves all of that behind after life crushed him. And he came out here to Dakota to mourn, to heal, to recover, to discover what he later would call the strenuous life. I call that the fulcrum of the hero's journey. In this incredible life where there is so much to learn, not about Theodore Roosevelt, but from Theodore Roosevelt, this place, Dakota, is where his life changed. And he found the resilience to go on. And I think that's really what we want to tell that story in this museum, because if you've ever suffered loss in your life and had to find the resilience to go on, you can relate to Theodore Roosevelt. If you are thinking about the value of hard work worth doing, you find value in Theodore Roosevelt. And this is the place. This is the only place in the world that we can tell that story.
Is that not a great answer? Oh my God! Like,
Wow.
I just want to have them come to my house and tell me stories. Both of these guys, could you just come over later?
Sure.
We usually end up on Rolf's porch or by the bonfire.
Really?
You know?
That's awesome. My friends don't know any of this stuff.
Can we go back to the other question about Roosevelt and his statement that he wouldn't have been president? Of course,
man.
experiences
Yes.
here
Here we
for
go.
just a minute.
Yes.
Because that series of events that propelled him into the White House really, I think, started with his exploits in Cuba and the fame that came out of that. But you can't tell me that he would have been involved with the Rough Riders if it hadn't been for his experiences here in North Dakota as a cowboy and as a rancher. That was the beginning of that series of events. And that idea didn't just coalesce in TR's mind in 1898 when the Rough Riders were being formed. In 1886, when he was living out here on his ranches, there was a potential conflict with Mexico, rumors of a war with Mexico, because an American Army captain named Emmett Crawford had chased Geronimo into Mexico, and he had the bad luck to get himself killed, but not by the Apache, but by the Mexicans. And there was a great hue and cry about that, and people wanted to strike back against Mexico. And so TR wrote to the Secretary of War, William Endicott, and wanted to raise a cowboy army.
Right.
And while he was in Mandan to testify in the proceedings against the thieves who'd stolen his boat, he went across the river to the territorial capital, talked to the governor there about this idea, who thought it offered every available assistance. And the Bismarck Tribune wrote a glowing article about what a great idea this was. Right. But the point is, that idea started here on the ranches. And that led to that series of events.
And just very quickly, if I can add, this is what I love about Theodore Roosevelt. He can be two things at the same time, right? He can be both a progressive who is a pragmatist. He is a Republican who runs as an independent. He is a hunter who is a conservationist. You cannot name an issue that he dealt with in his time at the birth of the American century that we're not dealing with today. I mean, I think about the panels that we heard tonight, and the first, of course, the strenuous life and focusing on ability rather than disability. The thought that civic discourse and dialogue is the way to actually move forward despite your positions, and the appreciation for culture. He was both an Easterner and a Westerner. Without that experience, you don't get Theodore Roosevelt.
For both of you, what can we learn politically from him in the past to where we are today politically?
Let me say one thing that he learned because of all of this that led to some of his political success first.
Okay.
And that is, he embraced this strenuous life, which meant that he was very, very actively involved on his ranches. He was involved in the roundups. He was involved in trying to stop stampedes. He spent countless hours in the saddle. At one point, he spent 40 hours in the saddle in the roundup of 1885 continuously, wore out 5 horses in the process. When the cowboys were cold, he was cold. When they were tired, he was tired. He was in there. But when he came out here, he was a dude by anybody's definition.
Yeah.
He was a dude. And he worked
Fancy.
very
Did he have a
hard.
hat like that?
He was a fancy pants.
And
Bill.
he learned.
Fancy pants?
Fancy
was.
I speak in my language.
Brooks Brothers fancy pants, to be specific.
And he learned, yeah.
It's not real, by the way.
And he learned very quickly that accident of birth or privilege or wealth or any of those things didn't count for anything with those cowboys out there that he was trying to ingratiate himself with, or to be one of them. He learned that everything that counted was grit and determination and hard work and honesty and not backing down in a fair fight. He learned those lessons, and those people became his multiplied a million times, became his constituents.
He's a guy's guy.
He
He's
was.
What I've been trying to do all my life, 55 years. I'd love to be that guy.
If you compare him with the Marquis de Maurice, who was the same age,
Fancy
also,
pants.
yes, very much.
Right.
And his idea was to bring some representation of aristocratic living out to the Badlands, where Roosevelt embraced the strenuous life and that minimalistic lifestyle, and it served him so well because he got along with those people, and they loved him eventually.
Let's talk a little bit about the library itself. Ed, can you give us a visual picture of what that might look like?
Sure. I mean, first of all, let's remember that we are embarking upon a mission that, I mean, the address of the library should probably be, improbable and impossible, right? This is a big idea. And it's a big idea not just because of the place that we want to build it and what we want to build, but we have nature and the Badlands as the fourth wall of this museum. We have the national park, Theodore Roosevelt National Park, the only park named for an individual, not just a president, as a partner and a potential to bring people out into this experience of the park. We have the ability to build it as a platform, right? We're building this museum in the 2020s, not the 1920s. So all of what you just discussed is absolutely reverent and true, but we can talk about the controversies around Roosevelt. We can look at some of the experiences, and we can use digital technologies, immersive storytelling, all sorts of new tools to bring people into an experience, and we can make Theodore Roosevelt National Park a bucket list park for the next 100 years. I mean, that's an incredible opportunity. We can reorient Medora and North Dakota as the gateway to the West.
Raise the hands. Who wants the belt? Raise your hands. We're signing them up today. Doug's on the way. The governor, he will take dollars.
I hope the governor raised his hand.
Is he out there? But he's going to take your dollars as you walk out the door. So in this library/museum, if there's one item in Roosevelt's history, what's the one item that this library has to have? We got to have it. We got to search and find it. What is it? Rolf, you got an
Well, I have my answer, but my interest is in Roosevelt's experiences in North Dakota. And
Okay.
of course, the Roosevelt experience in his life is much bigger than that. But for sure, the Theodore Roosevelt cabin, which is his original multi-cross cabin that now stands out in the weather
Okay.
behind the Park Visitor Center, needs to be put indoors
that
where it
inside.
can be preserved forever. And I know there's been talk about rebuilding the Elkhorn cabin too. I don't know if that's going to happen or not. Maybe Ed
Okay.
has some ideas about that. But if so, it needs to go indoors where it'll be preserved.
So Ed, just as we wrap up here, where are we at in the library? Read, the state legislature's given us some money, and so talk a little bit about that.
Well, I'm 14 days on the job. So
14 days.
So we're nearly there. Look, I think this is going to be, there's going to be a long process of working through design, architecture, actual site selection. Obviously, the capital campaign is paramount. No money, no mission. We are going to undertake that with the notion that we've got a $50 million endowment from the state of North Dakota contingent upon $100 million in private funds. That's sort of remarkable when you think about it, right? For every $2 we raise privately, we get $1 from the state. That's a great opportunity. So we have a lot to do. I think that the important thing to remember here is that we are embarking on an incredible mission, and we want the people of North Dakota to be a part of it. This is not a top-down process. This is not something that is going to be bestowed by a board and placed in the Badlands. This is not a box in the Badlands with objects that we are going to collect from around the world. We want the active involvement, a dialogue with the people of North Dakota. We want a dialogue with the town of Medora, with Billings County, and we want to make sure we do this. We want to do this right.
Awesome, great. We are now going to take some questions. These two will do the answers. Not me. Unless it's a Van Halen question. Those will be after. Questions? Yes.
How do you keep oil exploration from impacting Theodore Roosevelt National Park?
Yeah, so I think that this is a quintessential example of what we discussed in panel 2, civic dialogue. Everything that Theodore Roosevelt faced in his time, we are facing now. Industrialization and conservation. And notice I didn't say versus conservation, right? The rapid advancement of technology and how that impacts every decision that we make in public and private ways. And if we do this right, this is not a box in the Badlands with objects that we can all come view, but it can be a place of civic discussion about that important issue and many, many others. When I was asked actually to describe my aspiration for the museum, I said the JFK Library meets the Aspen Institute. So what you've experienced here tonight is what we are aiming to do in scholarly education, in dialogue, in conferences, in conversation. And if we, again, bring people of what are supposedly opposing sides together, but they're not really, right? You think about, again, Theodore Roosevelt is an Easterner and a Westerner. He's quintessentially American. So we all need to be able to get around the table and have that discussion in a civic way.
Rolf, you spent a lot of time out west. What do you think?
Well, it's a tough problem, and there are threats from all sides. The good news is that right now, if we talk about the Elkhorn unit in particular, it's almost as Theodore Roosevelt found it. At one point, Congress had declared that the ranch should be rebuilt, the building should be reconstructed, but that didn't happen. And so we now go to the Elkhorn. It's still very tranquil. There's very little imposition from the oil industry. There are possible threats from a bridge. There's a possible threat from a gravel operation not too far away, but it's still very tranquil, very peaceful, and very much as TR found it. Not as he left it, but as he found it. And that's a wonderful thing.
Okay. Another question.
Along the lines of those quintessential ideas that have been shared, I wonder if you can go a little bit deeper and talk about potential for collaboration with some powerhouses that exist in the state along the lines of leadership, statesmanship, along the lines of conservation, stewardship, technology, infrastructure, along the lines energy, natural resources, or transformational learning. I think all of those, or several of those items point into the future, and future is really what you are aiming to capture in this. I wonder if you want to unpack any of those aspects.
Me very quickly, because obviously that is an enormous question. As the governor likes to point out, one, we'd like to build a platform, right? And what a platform means is that it is available for everybody to build upon it, and we don't know what exactly will come of the making of that platform, right? It's sort of open source development, if you will, in ideas, in scholarship, in everything that we can provide in terms of education. And I think that's just an enormous, enormous opportunity. The partnerships are almost limitless. I mean, the strange thing about TR, and if Joe Wiegand, the recreator who's at Medora, were here, you can't name an issue in which he wasn't involved, and therefore you can't name a group that wouldn't be a likely partner in this, right? Everybody from the NCAA to the Boone and Crockett Club to the National Park Service to, I mean, you can go on and on and on and on. And I think that that's what we need to harness in this. We want to look for partners who can do things that we can't do and look at this as a platform, not just a museum.
Rolf?
I have one last comment, and it isn't really on that point, and that is I think that
Right.
this is just a very, very wonderful opportunity for North Dakota and a tremendous thing, and a lot of people have worked very hard to make this happen, but it would not be happening without the efforts of the governor here. It wouldn't.
I
All right.
agree.
They say the governor is in the building. So thank you, Governor. And who found Ed? Ed, fantastic. I mean, I'm signing up. I hope you all are signing up. How can we help?
I mean, you can help by spreading the word, and you can help by being a part of the capital campaign. Every single dollar counts. We have to raise $100 million in private funds to show the state that we are worthy of what they have allocated. And you know, we're bringing on a chief fundraiser soon. We're going to be outlining the events that we're going to be doing across the state. I've already hit up my new friend at the education level across North Dakota to engage our school children. She was backstage and she said, I know, okay, yes, I want to go, please, I'm with you. So from the ground up, we want people invested in this idea. And that means get involved in whatever way you can. Do what you can with what you have where you are.